You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. Chapter 12. How can you be here because of me? Eliana asked, stepping back from Silmar and Velden. You're the daughter of Emerys Windrin, the High Priestess, Silmar said. After 14 years missing, she's still the hope of the Vendarin people, who have been under tyranny for far too long. We've all made a promise to protect you for her sake. He glanced back over his shoulder, as if expecting Arvid or Vera at any moment. It was a legitimate concern, but following strangers into the woods seemed equally concerning. Still, what if he could tell her more? Eliana let her mother's name roll around in her mind, trying to decide if it fit the woman she couldn't remember. She joined it with Rildon, as if their names alone could bring back knowledge lost long ago. She sounds important, Eliana said. Silmar studied her, but didn't expand on her family history. She's also just a really nice person. Everyone loves her, Velden added, then frowned. Except for the king and queen. And Mavis. And anyone who serves them. Which is why we need to leave, Silmar said. Now. That still doesn't explain how you knew I'd be here. Eliana crossed her arms over her chest. Tonight. We didn't, Velden said. Not exactly. It's the drop-off point for the Lorvandan Star Bridge, and we knew you'd arrive here sometime between your 17th and 18th year. Your parents always planned to have your father bring you back sometime this year. Only, he didn't bring you back. Arvid and Vera did. So we got a bit lucky on the timing. Their answers only stirred up a dozen more questions, reminding her they could be telling just as many lies as Arvid and Vera. Run to safety now, answer questions later, Velden said. He tugged on Cyrus's sleeve and angled his head toward the woods, but Cyrus let out an awful moan. Velden released his grip, and Cyrus pulled back his sleeve. The gash on his hand seemed longer, stretching into his wrist and continuing to pool blood. Eliana gasped, closing the distance between them. Oh, Cyrus. She held out a hand, but he flinched back from her touch. I'm so sorry. He never should have crossed the barrier. He should have been worshipping the stars under the watchful eyes of his grandparents, who should both still be very much alive. Why in Riston had every little detail gone wrong to leave him here like this? Silmar kneeled down in front of Cyrus, who still held his hand protectively against his chest. Velden stood behind him, placing his hands on Cyrus's shoulders, holding him in place. Eliana's skin prickled. What are you doing? Silmar positioned his hands on Cyrus's arm, eliciting a whimper that elevated to a cry. You're hurting him! Eliana yanked on Silmar's arms, but he was like a rock, eyes closed, hands sliding along Cyrus's exposed flesh. She pulled harder, but her efforts only brought Velden around to pull her away. Just watch, the man whispered as his sticky fingers held her wrists. Cyrus's cries settled into a sigh, his eyes closing. This time, when Eliana pressed forward, Velden let her. Beneath Silmar's hands, Cyrus's flesh melded together, the line of the cut more stain than wound. It was sloppy, but effective, and the bleeding ceased. "Thank you," Cyrus murmured. "I can only do so much. We need Lukai." Silmar opened his eyes to half slits and rubbed at the scruff of his beard. "Wrap the skin. It will be tender." It seemed like he wanted to say more, but he sat back in a slump. Velden reached into a bag tied at his waist, pulling out what looked like dried seaweed. It expanded before Eliana's eyes, dripping with water coming from Velden's webbed fingers. He wrapped the moist plant around Cyrus's hand like a bandage, the seaweed clinging to itself as if growing into one solid mass. "That should help some with the pain, too," Velden said. "But you healed him," Eliana said. Velden glanced up at her, his smile shifting to a smirk as he stood. "What did you think we were doing?" She clamped her lips down, aware her mouth had hung open like a child's on winter solstice. Velden turned to Silmar, not waiting for an answer as he bent over the older man to assess his strength. She'd expected Velden and Silmar to act as Arvid had, to use Cyrus's vulnerability to their advantage. But healing him? With magic? That idea had never occurred to her. It made even less sense than her assumption, and yet she'd seen it with her own eyes. She supposed that was what Arvid did on a much smaller scale each time he cut her and then sealed her skin. From Arvid, it had seemed like self-preservation, to ensure no one knew what he'd done. But from Silmar, it had seemed kind. She scratched at the edge of the marks on her back, the ones Arvid had placed when they first arrived. She was tempted to ask them to heal those wounds, but wasn't sure she trusted anyone to use any kind of magic on her. What would happen when her magic made its second mark in a few days? Would the marks go away on their own, or would she have to ask someone to remove them? Out of habit, she scanned the skies, but there were no dark spirits. "Your half-lights," she said the words slowly, as if drawing the truth out of them with each syllable. "And you use your blood for magic?" Velden's head bobbed back and forth, as if weighing her words. "We use the energy in our blood, yes." She glanced at his hands, both exposed and fully intact. "Where do you draw it from?" Velden's brow furrowed, but it was Silmar who responded with his own question, his voice wary. "When did Arvid and Vera take you from your father?" "My father?" She hated how the word rekindled that same hope. It was like they knew the mention of the parents she thought were dead was enough to get her to stay and hear them out. "I've never met my father." Velden's eyes widened. He reached for her hand, pulling her sleeve back to reveal the scars crisscrossing her palm, along with her current wound, which still oozed. Eliana surprised herself by being slow to cover the scars, unsure if she was still in shock over the events of the night, or if she maybe wanted him to see, wanted him to understand without her having to explain. But why didn't he and Silmar have the same scars as her? Silmar swore under his breath. "She's been trained in blood magic." "How often do you draw your blood?" Velden asked. "They took blood almost daily," stored what they didn't use. Velden and Silmar exchanged a glance. "She'll need to be weaned," Silmar said. Velden grimaced. "We don't have time for that." "We'll have to make time." "What are you talking about?" Eliana asked, rising from the moss. Distant shouts carried on the wind, and they all stiffened. "We can't stay here. It's not safe." Silmar stood as well, leaning heavily on his staff, which now appeared solid again. "Come with us. We'll have Lukai heal your friend. We can teach you about your magic. All the things Arvid and Vera probably left out." Velden nodded, then gripped Cyrus's elbows to pull him to his feet. Something shifted between them, as if the motion brought Cyrus awake and made Velden tired, like energy had been passed or shared between them. All three turned toward the forest, but Eliana held her ground. "Can you teach me how to get rid of my magic?" she asked. Velden stilled, and Silmar glanced back, squinting at Eliana. "Get rid of it? Whatever for?" "The magic in my blood," she hesitated. "It's done unspeakable things." Silmar grunted his disagreement. "Arvid and Vera have done unspeakable things using your blood." He turned once more to lead them through the forest. "I killed an entire family," Eliana blurted out. Cyrus's mouth dropped open, and she lowered her eyes. "I ran from Arvid and Vera and hid in a barn. But the pain, I couldn't take it. I used leeches to drain my blood, but it wasn't enough. When I finally released my blood," she shuddered, "the owners and their children, they were all dead." The repetitive call of an exotic bird was all Eliana heard for several long moments. "You remember killing them?" Silmar asked. Eliana shook her head. "There are gaps in my memory. When the magic builds and finally releases, I'm not always in control." "You probably invited in dark spirits." Silmar's voice held a rebuke. "She didn't know," Velden said. "It still makes the weaning process that much harder." Silmar studied her like a wild animal he debated putting down or trying to tame. "What dark spirits?" Cyrus asked. Silmar ignored his question, turning back around. "You couldn't have killed the farmer's family without help," he called over his shoulder as he resumed walking. "Not without a starlock." Eliana pictured the barrel of trinkets she'd seen in the Stargazer, but she still didn't know what they were. Even so, his words gave her pause. If her blood alone hadn't killed the family, what had? When she followed Silmar, Velden and Cyrus took up the rear. "Was it the dark spirits?" she asked. The idea wasn't any more palatable, not if she was the one who called them by spilling her blood. But it helped her understand how it had happened. "More likely Arvid," Velden muttered from behind. They fell into line, and Eliana mulled over Velden's accusation, afraid to hope that it could be true. She still wasn't completely innocent if Arvid had used her blood, but maybe there was a chance she could learn to neutralize it. If Silmar and Velden weren't concerned about the dangers of her magic, then she'd go with them, for now. Not because they offered to teach her magic, and as terrible as it was, not even because they had someone who could heal Cyrus. They claimed to know her parents, and if her parents still lived, she wanted to find them. Silmar led them to the other side of the clearing, then down a path through the rainforest. His pace was slow considering the urgency he'd expressed. Eliana lifted her hair off her neck, wondering if this heat was why both men kept their hair so short. Random questions like that mingled with more complicated questions about magic and star bridges and her parents, making it difficult to focus and grasp the most important ones. Are you still looking for my mother? The familial word felt strange, yet welcome on her lips. There's been no need to search. Silmar turned, his face twisted in what she thought was a grimace, but might have been sympathy. When your father took you across the barrier, Mavis kidnapped your mother. We haven't had the resources to rescue her until recently, but we knew she would want us to ensure your safety first. One truth stood out from his dire words. Her mother was alive. And my father? Rildon? Time will tell. I don't believe Arvid was telling the truth, but I didn't have magic to waste on sifting his words. Who is Mavis? Eliana asked. Mavis is another high priestess, Veldon said. She wasn't as popular as Emerus, so she took out the competition. Silmar grunted from up ahead, but didn't comment. That's not... Cyrus straightened, affronted. What kind of priestesses do you have over here? Most are harmless, Veldon said. Mavis is her own kind. Now that you've found me, Eliana asked, are we going to rescue my mother? It's not that simple, but yes. Silmar's voice ebbed and flowed with the wind. It can be that simple, Veldon said, but not if Silmar's explaining it. The older man rested his glare on Veldon. We have a handful of progenies hidden in a cave. Our group's mission was to retrieve you. Now that we've accomplished it, we'll head out to join the others. Make our way to Mavis so we can rescue your mother. What are progenies? Cyrus asked. Half-lights who can do magic, Veldon said. That's not exactly precise if Silmar started. Veldon let out a theatrical gasp. I forgot, he said, raising his hands in mock defense. No one but the master may instruct the students. Eliana felt the tug of a smile on her lips, a strange sensation after all they'd been through. Then she caught sight of Cyrus studying her, as if applying their words to who she was and what she could do. There was a hint of admiration in his gaze that she didn't want. She rushed to catch up with Silmar. What did you mean when you said I needed to be weaned? Your body is used to the release of blood, Silmar said. It's like a cow that needs milking. The more the cow is milked, the more its body supplies milk to meet the demand. Veldon groaned from behind Eliana. Have some tact, my friend. You just compared the lady to a cow. Cyrus laughed uncomfortably, but Eliana wasn't amused or offended. The words touched on the truth of her experience too much for her to feel anything other than understood. It builds, she agreed, like a boil needing to burst. Veldon made a noise of disgust. That's even worse. But apt. A smile was evident in Silmar's voice, like a teacher pleased by his student's success. Can my blood be neutralized? Eliana asked. You can learn to control its energy, Veldon said. Eliana shook her head. No, I mean remove it. Silmar paused, half turning to study her face. He cleared his throat.
If you learn to control it, there will be no need to remove it. But our priority will be weaning you from the blood magic.
He faced forward again, picking up his lumbering pace among the thinning foliage. She didn't quite agree, but less supply and demand of magic was a step in the right direction.
What about Arvid and Vera?
Cyrus asked.
Why didn't they just use their own blood?
They did, Eliana said. I mean, when I was younger. Around 13, they tested mine and never went back. I used to think they didn't want to cut themselves, but now I'm guessing theirs isn't as strong.
Exactly,
Silmar said.
They have so little star blood, they probably never even had the basic skills in the hub of the Wheel of Magic.
What's the Wheel of Magic? Cyrus asked, his voice breathy. Now you've done it, Veldin muttered. Eliana glanced back, tripping over a root jutting out of the rich soil. Cyrus's eyes glinted in the moonlight. She thought she'd sentenced him to this foreign existence after watching his grandmother murdered, but he almost sounded eager to be here. She supposed it was like the books in the Stargazer's library coming to life for him.
If the source of our magic is the energy in our blood, the Wheel of Magic is the product.
Silmar's voice gained volume, the gravelly quality thicker and more obvious.
The simplest magic only requires that energy, the movement of small objects, the infusion of that energy into muscle. It enhances what our bodies and the things around us already do on a daily basis by speeding it up or making it more. That type of adjustment is the hub of the wheel, and most half-lights who have enough star blood can make those adjustments during their puberty years.
Waves crashed against a rocky beach they'd almost reached, the sound overriding everything else. The surrounding bamboo had been replaced by ferns, which were thinning as the soil grew rockier. Light finally filtered through the clouds as the moon's descent shifted to the sun's morn. There wasn't a boat in sight. Despite everything, there was something about the sea that calmed Eliana, something about the salty scent that put her at ease. And then they're trained to control it? She asked. If that was the case, she was several years behind.
Not quite.
Silmar paused to lean heavily on his staff.
If they don't earn a Starlock, they outgrow their skills. Only the progenies go on to train. So even though you have magic, you won't be a progeny until you earn your Starlock.
What's a Starlock? Cyrus asked.
It's a lock of hair sent down by the stars.
Silmar reached under his tunic, pulling out a metal staff hung from a leather cord, an oddly detailed miniature of the weapon he carried.
They're encased in metal, each a unique shape. They enhance a half-light's magic, guiding and controlling it along one of the 3 spokes on the Wheel of Magic: pneumatic, somatic, and noetic. But Starlocks are becoming more and more rare. It's not even 1 in 10 anymore.
They're earned during an awakening, Veldin added. Usually some life-threatening experience that's never spoken of.
Unless you're Veldin,
Silmar muttered. Veldin turned and winked at Eliana. I fought off a giant squid that had just smashed an entire ship in half. How could I not talk about it? For a moment, both she and Cyrus chuckled, but when their eyes met, his smile dropped, his face taking on the heaviness of grief. Silmar cleared his throat.
Awakenings are both feared and desired. Not everyone survives, but if you walk away with a Starlock, You are chosen, a progeny, hand-picked by the sun to tap deeper into the wheel of magic.
Eliana shivered. It sounded like the exact opposite of what she was asking them to teach her. The sun? Cyrus asked. You mean the stars?
The stars are created beings just like us, Silmar said. They serve the sun and do its bidding, same as we do.
For a moment, Cyrus looked like he might argue, but thankfully he kept his mouth shut. They followed the shoreline around until it looked like they'd be forced to stop where the water met a cliff.
A starlock functions like the axle of the wheel, Silmar added. It gets it turning, allowing the progeny to develop stronger magic along one of the spokes. There's a constructive and destructive side to each of the 3 spokes, giving 6 possible paths out from the axle for each progeny.
Eliana's heart pounded, pushing the blood she'd always seen as a danger faster through her veins. Silmar talked of it all almost lovingly, but to Eliana it sounded no better than the magic her guardians had used. How does blood magic fit in? She asked. His face grew grim as the scars puckered his eyes and lips into an even deeper frown.
Blood magic skips from the hub to the rim of the wheel, giving half-lights access to uncontrolled elemental magic. It's a distortion of magic's design, a cheat, and it comes with great consequences. I'm grateful they didn't teach you to perform the magic with them, but rather stole your blood for their own use.
Veldon snorted. They weren't protecting her. They were protecting themselves. They knew she would grow into a progeny who would surpass their skills. Silmar lifted a shoulder.
And yet I'm still grateful. The addiction to her blood's release will be hard enough to break as it is. It would be far worse if she were also addicted to the rush of using it. It would be much harder for her to resist the pull of the dark spirits.
Despite the warm air, Eliana's limbs felt like ice. She'd rather give up the minimal good that might come from using her blood's power than risk giving in to its darker pull. Silmar stopped near an outcropping, and they halted with him, water lapping at their heels. He then tapped against thick vines growing along a rock. The leaves muted the sound of his staff until his tapping revealed a small gap in the vines.
Here we are,
Silmar said. From inside the cave, hands split the vines to reveal a man's shocked face.
Sun's fire. You found her.
Morning dew from the vines fell into his golden hair, the short ends curling slightly around the crown of his head. The upturn of his nose gave him a playful look, despite the worry pinching his features. Heat spread across her cheeks when he studied her in return. It was as if he was evaluating her worth, but unlike the inebriated men Arvid spent time with, this man's pale blue eyes were clear. And instead of drunken lust, his freshly shaved face held admiration. The longer he stared, the more uncomfortable Eliana grew, and yet there was something almost familiar about him, like she'd known him years ago, and if they spent a single day catching up, they'd be the best of friends.
Welcome home, Eliana.
His voice softened, as though it were just the two of them standing at the mouth of the cave. He held out a hand, not in greeting, but in invitation. Was he going to pull her in for a hug? Eliana bristled at the familiarity, but it also stirred something inside her, unlocking some dormant part of who she'd been long ago. Cyrus leaned in to whisper.
Do you know him?
Eliana blinked, the spell between her and the stranger finally broken. Veldon chuckled. Eliana, meet Lukai, your bondmate.
Chapter 13. By the time Karyne reached town, he had to hunt Larkos down in a tavern to round up their crew and supplies early. The loyal man grumbled at the inconvenience until Karyne handed over his family ring. The royal seal would open every door as well as every mouth, but Karyne was more concerned about missing whatever remained at Bamboo Island than he was worried about people's assumptions and interpretations of his purpose and sanity. With Larkos managing the final tasks, Karyne returned home to get his bags packed and affairs settled. Half his wardrobe lay spread across his bed when the dreaded knock came at his door. Enla barged in without waiting for a reply. "What is the meaning of this?" She held out a paper with the family seal, but Karyne didn't bother taking it before stuffing more clothes in a bag. A request to procure an artifact. He had to give some credit to Larkos. He'd worked fast in one night. "Yes, I can read." His sister raised her eyebrows. "I already told you no." "You said no to Valorian and Lover's Falls. Now I want to go to Bamboo Island." He didn't care as much about the Starbridge anymore. Not if Eliana had crossed the barrier with it, but Enla didn't need to know all that. Karyne left her standing open-mouthed as he closed his last bag and headed to the next room, where a steaming bath with lilac soaps and fresh nightclothes waited. "Did you think it's Lover's Falls I'm afraid of? I need you here, Karyne. We both know you don't trust me enough to give me any responsibilities you aren't overseeing. You'll take care of things while I'm gone." He pulled his shirt off and threw it at Enla to give him space from her glare. She sputtered and flung it off her shoulder, then spun on her heel as he tugged down his pants. "Karyne Eleness, you're impossible. Mother and father already think you're a lost cause. It's like you don't want me to convince them you can be more." Karyne smiled as he eased into the bath, letting the steam and flower scent invade him. He'd hoped stripping for a bath would make his sister leave, but it was easier having this conversation with her back, so it was still a win. You shouldn't have to convince them. They should see that all on their own because they see what I'm doing and they understand. Not because you've made me do what you would do if you were me. Some sort of huff met his ears, but he dunked underwater, grateful he couldn't see her expression. When he surfaced, she was mid-speech. "The one person I trust, you're my one ally. What does it say to mother and father every time you hop on a boat? What does it say to Lenda every time you leave without even a goodbye? That's not how you should treat your bondmate. And what about me?" Karyne rested his arms over the tub's edge, the break in his sister's voice finding that little nerve in his body that knew how to twinge with guilt. "We have meetings with the council," she continued. "Dignitaries coming from Mavis." "Mavis?" Karyne asked. An image of the high priestess and her wicked grin, more teeth than lips, floated through Karyne's mind. I've never trusted her. Why do we need to meet with dignitaries from the eastern provinces anyway? Mavis's control as a high priestess over the other servants of the sun in the Sun Gazers had been growing in the east. Between her subtle shift in power and the recreants' outright demand to bring down the monarchy, he didn't know which was the bigger threat to their family's rule in LNS. But for some reason, his sister and parents weren't concerned. "Don't you pay attention to anything? Mother and father want to seal her authority as a spiritual leader for the nation in order to differentiate their governing authority. Plus, there are the recreants in the south to deal with. I need you around when things get hard. I'm not abandoning you. I'll be back well before the dignitaries arrive. If you trust me as much as you say, trust that this is something I need to do. Not just for me, but for you, for our people." His words weren't lies, but he wasn't sure he could explain their truth. Daisy was important. He'd known it as a child, and his certainty had only grown over the years. Enla's hesitation gave him hope. He lathered up with soap, waiting for her response, but the longer her silence went on, the more his hope soured into dread. "Who is she?" He stilled, the water suddenly too cold, too suffocating. "You sifted my future." It wasn't a question. It was the only way she could know. He'd never spoken about Daisy with Enla. Normally, she had to be near the person whose future she sifted, but with Karyne, she had other means, objects that contained elements of his essence. Over the years, it had progressed from childhood trinkets to locks of hair and letters. Now he was fairly certain she'd gone back to using the pyramid-shaped bead they'd made with Riverin years ago. Sometimes the older and more meaningful objects were better conduits. "Every path I sift has you leaving on that boat. Not every path has you returning." Her soft words held pain. He winced. "You shouldn't search that much." When she went down multiple paths, it left her weak, and not just because it drained the energy in her starlock. There was a confusion that came with seeing so many options, almost like having a memory play out 100 different ways until she couldn't remember how it really happened. Only worse, because the memories were mere possibilities. "If you're honest with me, I won't need to search so much." He studied the slump of her shoulders, the way her feet scuffed at the tile. She wore the soft pants and tunic reserved for sleeping, and her hair was loose around her ears and forehead as if hiding her starlock could hide the weight of her role. She was his sister once more instead of the future queen. Older than him, but always smaller, needing protection. Protection he didn't feel fit to provide. What did she look like? He asked. It could be the stranger he'd met, but he suspected it was Daisy. Or maybe he hoped. Knowing she was in his future only spurred him on to leave sooner. "Strange." Enla's voice gained the faraway tone that never failed to make Karyne squirm. Her visions were always disjointed. Their accuracy had grown with her trainer's influence, but they were still too unpredictable to be anything other than a suggestion. "Like she's from another time. Russet brown waves to her waist, piercing green eyes, regal grace in humble rags. Remember your bond. You forget in some paths." He snorted at the idea. He was chasing a child, an innocent life he'd always felt responsible for. But the warning in Enla's voice was unmistakable. He did the math, realizing the girl would be approaching 18, more of a woman. The 5 years that separated them in childhood would feel far less now. Karyne shook his head to clear his thoughts. Bonded or not, he didn't have time for distractions. Her name's Eliana. He supposed he should learn to call her by her real name. It wasn't likely that she still made daisy chains into crowns. "She's the daughter of my dedication priestess." Enla shifted, as if she might turn around, then caught herself. "Mother said you came home early because the priestess died." Huh, interesting. He'd always wondered what his parents had been told. He stood and grabbed a towel off the stool to wrap it around himself. Enla still didn't turn as he stepped out, dripping on the rug. Maybe if he told her the truth, she'd let him go. "I don't actually know what happened to the priestess. Maybe she died. I hope not. But people came to steal Eliana away. A bright light took her, along with her father and 2 of the strangers. They crossed the barrier with a starbridge." He spoke with confidence, but Enla still laughed. "Starbridges aren't real. They're part of the ancient myths." Fernandus would be horrified to hear your heretical words. He knew she smiled, even though she still didn't turn. The old priest was half blind and mostly deaf, but he doted on them both as if they were his grandchildren. Karyne's faith had far more to do with Fernandus's care and convictions than anything Karyne had learned from his parents. "Something else probably blinded you as they ran off. You were young. You can't trust your memories." Her voice hitched. She knew all too well that he could trust his memories. Tuning in to memories was his strongest point on the noetic spoke. He'd relived the memory 1,000 times. The small girl's wide green eyes, her pudgy hands reaching out to him even as her father took her away. The Starbridge was supposed to have taken them to safety, but the strangers had used blood magic. Crossing the barrier wouldn't have kept Daisy and her father safe from that. Karyne ran a hand through his wet hair, then shook his head like a dog, more to splash Enla than to dry off. Earlier tonight there was a light across the water. She stepped away, glaring over her shoulder as he grinned. I've heard. It's all the servants can talk about. Some light from the southern provinces. They think it had to have been a high priest or some other extremely powerful progeny who died. Either that or someone who's about to come into a lot of power. There are rumors it was more than one star who must have delivered or removed a starlock. Karyne let out a derisive snort. The stars no longer communed with people, but they still came to deliver and remove the charms blessed by the sun. When a progeny passed on to the sun's brilliance, their body and starlock were left on the rooftop to be burned up by the stars. Both the delivery and removal left a streak of light in the night sky, but neither matched what Karyne had seen. I saw it with my own eyes from the mangrove trees. It's not a starlock. It was identical to the light I saw as a child. Her skeptical gaze faltered. Meeting Riverin again? She almost sounded jealous. He held back his surprise. No, I haven't seen him since Mother and Father's party. Might as well come clean if she already suspected. She bit her lip and turned away. I've heard he's in trouble. Trouble? He grabbed the stack of clothes and stalked back to the bedroom. That's all I know. You'll have to ask him for details. I don't want details. He pulled on his shirt, and Enla settled by the door, her back turned again. Fine. Tell me more about the light. It came from across the water and traveled east to the southern provinces, near Bamboo Island. Impossible. He laughed as he pulled on his pants. You still don't believe humans exist across the barrier? I told you I saw them a year ago when you've always told me you've seen things. Ever since we were kids. You've made every effort to trick me into believing the most ridiculous lies, so forgive me if I don't believe everything you say anymore. He tapped her shoulder, and she turned, unable to hide the hurt in her eyes. Everything I'm telling you now is true. No lies and no jesting. There's another woman in the mangrove trees. Her name is Aura. Short, dark hair, skin a shade lighter than mine. She's young, I think, but her eyes are ancient, weighted. Was she in your visions? Enla frowned. No. What is she doing out there? Hopefully recovering. When I found her, I thought she was dead, but then she sucked in a breath, and it was like her skin glowed. It wasn't purely somatic energy. No one can bring themselves back from the dead like that. Enla shook her head slightly. That's not... I've never heard of magic like that. Exactly. Do you think it could be blood magic? Enla whispered, her face draining of color. He'd be lying if he said he hadn't already thought of it. There was no blood. I saw no brands on her hands. Unless she had vials of it stashed somewhere, but she was clean. I don't see how she could have used it that way. Enla nodded, the relief on her face mirroring his own. Most blood magic was detested by all Vendarans, even recreants, but the royal family had outlawed all forms of it 2 generations past. Recreants still fought for the right to do tracking spells, claiming their use was no different from the innocent amounts of blood mixed for a bonding ceremony. But if they decreed those forms of blood magic lawful today, tomorrow the recreants would ask to use it for branding, then rim magic, or even to call the dark spirits. It wasn't worth the risk. She wants me to take her to the Starbridge on Bamboo Island, Karyne said. Friend or foe, I need to see this through to understand what she can do. With her advanced magic, maybe she could even help Mother. It was a low blow to drag their mother's health into the equation, but it was also the truth. You won't even know I'm gone. She chewed her lip, eyes on his neck. You'll return within a moon's cycle? Maybe sooner, he grinned, even though it was unlikely with or without favorable winds. She smacked his shoulder. I meant what I said. I need you around. I know. He tried to wipe the smile off his face so his words might be more reassuring. The anticipation of being on the open seas, finding answers to his oldest questions, and discovering new magic made it impossible to contain his excitement. I need you to promise me that this is your last trip. Enla wrapped her hands around his forearm, her face pinched with the anxious weight of all her responsibilities. Even if you don't find what you're looking for, it's time for you to settle down with Lenda and be my throne warden. Most throne wardens took on their role at 18, and she'd let him roam the seas until 23. She'd given him far more time than he deserved, and yet it would never feel like enough. Not unless he came back with Daisy. I promise, he said, hoping it was true. Not because he truly agreed, but because this time he would find her. If he didn't, he might never get another chance to look. Enla's eyes lost focus again, visions plaguing her in ways he'd never understand. You can go to Bamboo Island. Trust Riverin to have your back. What does Riverin have to do with anything? She ignored his question. And stay away from Lover's Falls. All right. He wasn't planning to go to Lover's Falls anymore anyway. I have one more condition. Enla crossed her arms over her chest. Still buoyant from his success, he let a dangerous word slip from his mouth. Anything. Take Lenda with you.
I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might enjoy listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where Paeter and I narrate fantasy short stories from a variety of authors to help you find your next favorite author. Check it out at findingfantasyreads.com. Thanks so much for listening.